In this session, we're going to be talking about the Salem witchcraft trials that took place in Massachusetts Bay in 1692. This is reproduced in your textbook on page 86, so you may want to go and look at that so you can kind of see it a little bit more clearly, perhaps. This is a title page from a book that was written by Cotton Mather, who was a prominent Boston minister living there at the time. He was really involved in the Salem witchcraft trials. His father, Increase Mather, was also a very prominent minister, so they were extremely well known in the area. And so he writes this book pretty much as a justification for the Salem witchcraft trials. He had written an earlier book called Memorable Providences, in which he had talked about a suspected witchcraft of an Irish washerwoman in Boston. And it was really the description in that book that led many people to feel like witchcraft was kind of running crazy in the Salem, New England area. Now, in your notes that are provided in Canvas, I kind of go through and tell you the story of what happened, but I wanted to kind of emphasize a few details with you in this session. First of all, one thing to remember, the belief in witchcraft was very widespread in Europe and had been for quite some time. Lots of women had been burned at the stake for being suspected witches. Now, when people came over to the New World to establish colonies, to start new lives, they brought with them their cultural heritage. It would be like if you were to move to a different country today, you would take with you your beliefs, your knowledge, things that you had studied, things that you learned. Everything that you believe now would go with you. You wouldn't leave it behind just because you went to a different country. Well, it was the same situation here. Even though they were starting over in a new place, they still believed in witchcraft. They still believed that it was a very viable thing, that if things went wrong, sometimes you could lay it at the feet of witchcraft. If you had an illness that a doctor couldn't figure out what it was, a lot of times the doctors would say you were possessed by witchcraft. So this was a very common belief in this time period. It was a very normal, this was not abnormal at all to have some of these beliefs. So with that in mind, you can kind of begin to understand how this could have developed in Salem. You should also know that there were other trials in other colonies where witches were arrested and suspected witches were arrested and tried for witchcraft. This is simply one of the more larger incidents where you had more people accused, where people were put into prison, stayed there for a while, and you had very prominent trials taking place. And this has kind of come down in history, so that most people still, if they know, even if they know very little about colonial history, the Salem witchcraft trials are something that they are familiar with. Historians to this day are still trying to figure out exactly how it happened and why it happened. That is really the curiosity of it, I think. We know the basic facts. The girls acting very strangely, these young girls, teenage girls, acting strangely, diving under furniture, saying that they were being pinched, that, you know, that they were having fever, they would scream out in pain, and the doctor couldn't figure out what was wrong. And so he basically said, well, they're exhibiting all the symptoms of this woman in this book, Memorable Providences, that Cotton Mather wrote, and I believe that they are being possessed by witchcraft. Now, the odd thing about it was, one of these girls that started this was actually the daughter of the new minister. So that kind of adds a whole new element to it. So you have all these girls that are being afflicted, and then they start to make their accusations, as I said in the notes. Then you're going to have arrest made, trial started, and people start turning on one another and start pointing fingers at each other. A state of fear develops over the area. You become very afraid to speak up against these trials, against what the girls were saying. because it happened over and over again where when someone would attempt to do that, then the girls would turn in mass, turn in unison on you and say, well, if you're defending them, oh, I see your specter. I'm being pinched. I'm being attacked by you. And so then you would suddenly be accused of witchcraft yourself. And so people began to be afraid to speak up, to say anything. There is going to be a playwright named Arthur Miller who in the 1950s will write The Crucible. And it is set during the time of the Salem witchcraft trials. Now, he wrote it in the 1950s when Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism was raging, and when people were being accused without any evidence of being communist. Now, Miller knew that if he wrote his Crucible and set it in the 1950s, he would probably be arrested and accused of being a communist. So he set it during the time of the Salem witchcraft trials to kind of make the connection that people were afraid then and didn't speak up, and so that probably innocent women were sent off to prison. Some died there, and that the same kind of situation was happening in the 1950s out of fear because people wouldn't stand up and say, I don't think this is right. The trials were not held the way trials would be held today. Evidence that would be thrown out of court today was allowed back in that time period. And so you began to have the executions taking place. The girls' performances become more and more practiced. This becomes a real spectacle. People come to these trials because they want to see what the girls are going to do next. This is like high performance here. One theory is that the girls got so used to this attention and power and didn't want it to end that they kept making accusations, because this was attention that teenage girls normally would never receive in New England during that time, and these girls were now acquiring a great deal of power. So that's one theory, one explanation of what might have happened and why this continued. The one interesting story of Giles Corey is the fact that he isn't going to be hanged, but he is going to die. Giles wanted to save his farm, and he knew that if he refused to stand for trial, he would be pressed to death, but that the courts legally could not then take his farm, and he hoped it could go to his sons-in-law. So even though this man is over 80 years old, they put him down and they place large stones on him till they essentially suffocate him. And so he is going to actually be pressed to death. They're also going to execute 2 dogs before this is over with, because they thought dogs were used by witches. So this kind of becomes a hysteria. And that is another theory that some historians and scientists have, is that it was mass hysteria, because this is a documented thing in other instances where hysteria can take over. So there was some thought that this was hysteria. Another theory is that the girls had gotten hold of some like mushrooms or some rye bread that was poisoned, and they'd almost gone on like an acid trip, so that they were hallucinating when they were doing this. There's some evidence that animals in the area were also exhibiting some strange behavior, so there could be some type of a connection there. We really don't know. To this day, we really don't have a clear understanding of why it happened. We just know that it did, and the theories continue to be discussed. It was when it went and spread and kind of headed up into the higher elements of society, kind of the upper class, so to speak, and the governor's wife herself was actually accused that the Governor William Phipps, decided to step in and do something and kind of put a stop to this, and that's when the trials and the executions stopped. But from June until really September, you're going to have these executions going on. You're going to have people kind of languishing in jail, in prison, waiting for trial. You're going to have Dorcas Good, who is 4 years old when she's accused, and she is going to go insane in jail. So this was a major cultural event that took place in the colonies. But again, this was part of their cultural heritage, something that was very normal to them and something that they had brought with them from Europe when they came.